Two brothers, two offerings, one accepted, the other rejected. For generations, this story has been told as if its meaning was simple. Cain brought the fruit of the ground. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock and their fat. God looked upon Abel's offering with favor, but did not regard Cain's. We read it, we nod, we move on. But maybe we've never truly stopped to ask the question behind the question, why? Why did God regard Abel's offering but not Cain's? The common answer: because of the heart. Abel gave with sincerity, with reverence. Cain's heart wasn't right. That's what we've been taught. And yes, Scripture says God sees the heart. But then, why respond by not even looking at Cain's offering? Why such a dramatic dismissal if the issue was only internal? Now look closer. The text is shockingly specific about Abel. He brought the firstborn of his flock and their fat. This isn't poetic fluff, it's technical language. The firstborn was always considered holy. The fat, later codified in Levitical law, was the portion reserved for God. This isn't casual generosity, this is ritual precision. But here's the mystery. How did Abel know to do this? There was no written law yet, no Levitical priesthood, no Sinai, no temple, and yet Abel brought not just any sheep, but the firstborn, not just meat, but the fat. The very act God would later require of Israel's priests, Abel performed instinctively, or perhaps not instinctively at all. What if Abel wasn't improvising? What if he was following something passed down, something sacred, something ancient? And here lies the real question. Who taught Abel to offer in this way? Who showed him what kind of gift was pleasing to God? Who taught him that worship had a pattern, not just a feeling? If we've read this story for years and never asked that one simple question, who taught Abel, then maybe, just maybe, something has been hidden from us, not taken away, just left in silence, waiting to be heard by someone who finally pauses long enough to ask. There is a kind of silence in Scripture that feels deliberate, as if something sacred stands just beyond the words, seen only by those who linger long enough to notice what isn't said. For centuries, readers have wondered, how did Abel know what to offer? But buried in an ancient text once revered and now mostly forgotten, there may be an answer. The Book of Jubilees, preserved in the traditions of Ethiopian Christianity and found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, offers a detail that changes everything. In chapter 4, it states, "And he, Abel, brought of the firstlings of his sheep and of the fat thereof, and God looked upon it with favor." Sound familiar? Yes. But Jubilees doesn't just repeat Genesis, it clarifies it. Abel's act was not spontaneous, it was intentional. It followed a ritual. He offered a clean animal. He followed a pattern. The same sacred structure that would later appear in the laws of Moses was already present in Abel's time. That changes the narrative. Abel was not a creative worshipper. He was a faithful steward of something he received. And if that's true, then the question shifts. Where did this pattern come from? Could it be that Adam, taught directly by God to discern good from evil, was also taught the rhythm of sacrifice? Could it be that Abel inherited not just life from his father, but also a sacred memory, a covenantal rhythm that shaped his offering? If so, then Abel was not merely trying to please God. He was living within a divine cycle. His sacrifice wasn't a plea for blessing, it was a sign of alignment, an offering given in harmony with a sacred order that predated the law of Sinai. This wasn't about religion, it was about rhythm, about walking in time with heaven. And here's the quiet tragedy. If we still cling to the old idea that Abel's gift was accepted simply because he meant well, then we may be missing the deeper truth. A truth that has existed since the dawn of humanity. A truth that has been silenced, not erased, waiting in forgotten pages like those in Jubilees to be remembered again. What if the earliest humans didn't stumble through blind worship, but lived by a sacred calendar now lost to most of the world? And what if that calendar is still calling to those who will stop, listen, and remember? We've been taught for generations that the difference between Cain and Abel was simply a matter of the heart. Cain's offering was rejected because his intentions were impure. Abel's was accepted because he was sincere. That's the common explanation, and on the surface, it seems to fit. But what if that's not the whole story? What if we've been so focused on their inner attitudes that we missed something far more tangible, something right in front of us? Let's set emotion aside for a moment and look with different eyes, not at their hearts, but at their actions, their offerings, their methods. Cain brought some of the fruits of the ground. That's all we're told. No detail, no timing, no indication of sacrifice or ritual, just produce. Abel, on the other hand, brought the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. That's not just generosity, that's technical precision. In the later Levitical system, the fat was the holiest part of the sacrifice. The fat represented the best portion, the richness, the essence of life, and it was always reserved for God. This wasn't symbolic poetry, it was codified ritual, sacred protocol, and Abel followed it. Long before Moses, before Sinai, before the priesthood ever existed. So how did he know? How did Abel understand what part of the animal was most pleasing to the Lord? How did he know to offer the firstborn, the fat portions, and not simply what was convenient? There were no written laws, no priests, no tabernacle, and yet his sacrifice aligned perfectly with what would later become the backbone of Israel's worship. This isn't coincidence. It suggests something deeper, something ancient. Abel didn't invent the ritual. He wasn't experimenting. He was preserving something, repeating something, living something that had already been given. Could it be that Abel received a pattern passed down from Adam, who may have received it directly from God himself? Could it be that before any scroll was written, before any temple was built, a rhythm had already been whispered to mankind? A rhythm of worship, sacrifice, and covenant? If so, then Abel wasn't just a good-hearted man. He was the first keeper of a sacred order. And that makes the difference between Cain and Abel not just a matter of sincerity, but of alignment. Not just emotion, but obedience. Not just heart, but ritual faithfulness to a divine pattern. The Book of Jubilees offers more than just a retelling of Genesis. It provides a lens that reveals the structure behind what once seemed like spontaneous acts. When it speaks of Abel's offering, it doesn't merely say he gave an animal, it specifies what kind of animal. It tells us he offered the firstlings, the fat, and, most striking of all, it hints at the timing. This wasn't a random gesture of devotion. It was a ritual, done with order, done with purpose, done at the appointed time. This shifts the entire narrative. What we've long assumed was an emotional reaction, a man trying to please God out of the sincerity of his heart, suddenly looks more like the execution of a sacred protocol. A protocol that predates Sinai. A protocol that appears to have already existed, quietly preserved and passed down from the earliest humans. We're not looking at a man guessing his way toward holiness. We're seeing the first visible thread of a covenantal rhythm, a divine liturgy woven into creation itself. Abel didn't act on impulse. He stepped into alignment. He honored something larger than himself, a calendar, a system, a sacred framework that would later echo through the Levitical priesthood, but which had already begun long before. That means Abel wasn't just a man of faith. He was the first covenant keeper. He didn't invent a sacrifice. He fulfilled one, not to earn God's blessing, but to live within God's design. The offering of Abel wasn't just a gift. It was an act of participation in a cosmic rhythm, a signal that even in those earliest days, humanity was already being invited into a deeper pattern, one that connected heaven and earth. And if that's true, if there really was a system of sacred order before the law of Moses, then our theology has to shift. We can no longer say that God began revealing his ways only at Sinai. We must go back, further back, to Abel, to the origin of worship, to a time when Jah-ok, the covenant, was not yet written in stone, but already etched in action. Abel didn't need a title. He didn't need a temple. He only needed to move in time with the sacred. And maybe, so do we. The Book of Jubilees, in its quiet authority, presents a version of Abel that we rarely consider. A man not merely moved by reverence, but shaped by a sacred pattern. Chapter 4 of Jubilees states clearly that Abel brought an offering from clean animals, selected with care, and offered the fat portions, the part that later, in the Mosaic law, would be considered most holy. Even more remarkable, it says he did this at the appointed time. Not spontaneously, not randomly, but in rhythm, in season, in step with something older than himself. This cannot be coincidence. The precision of his act, the choice of animal, the attention to the fat, the timing, all suggest not improvisation, but inheritance. Abel was not a creative worshipper inventing his own way. He was the first recorded guardian of ritual, a man who preserved what had been handed down, and while he wasn't called a priest, there were no titles, no temple, no written law. He did what priests would later be instructed to do, because he had already been shown the way. He was the first to embody what it meant to live in covenant through ritual action. His sacrifice was not simply a gift, it was a response to a divine structure already in place. God's favor upon Abel's offering wasn't just about heart, it was about alignment. The approval was not just emotional, it was legal. A recognition that Abel had stepped into an ancient order and offered rightly within it. In that moment, he didn't just please God, he validated a system. He became the first human to enter the covenant through worship that mirrored heaven's instruction. And perhaps that's why the text says God looked with favor upon Abel and his offering. Not because of personality, not because of superiority, But because Abel recognized something sacred and responded correctly to it, his actions bore witness to a reality that stretched beyond the visible world, a spiritual architecture designed to connect humanity to the divine through order, sacrifice, and timing. So we must see Abel not merely as a symbol of sincerity, but as the first link in a long chain of sacred continuity. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't powerful, but he was faithful to a rhythm. He honored a pattern, he kept a memory alive, and in doing so, he inaugurated a priestly tradition that would one day span from Noah to Abraham, from Moses to Christ. Abel may have had no title, no sanctuary, no written command, but what he did was enough to awaken heaven's gaze. He stood at the dawn of human worship and stepped into the covenant, not with words, but with obedience. He didn't just make an offering, he reactivated a system. And in that moment, a forgotten order pulsed again with life. When the waters of the great flood finally receded, the world was silent. No cries of animals, no voices of men, just the echo of judgment fading over an earth wiped clean. It was a moment that could have marked a new beginning, a man emerging from the ark to rebuild, to claim, to dominate. But Noah didn't plant a garden first. He didn't stake territory. He didn't lay the foundation for a city. The very first thing Noah did was build an altar. That single act speaks volumes. It tells us that the first priority after divine judgment was not survival, but restoration of the sacred. And not just any worship, but worship according to an ancient pattern. The Book of Jubilees records this with stunning clarity. Noah selected clean animals, not randomly, but by category. He offered the correct number, not excessively, not minimally. He performed the ritual on the appointed day. The blood was poured, the fat was burned, the order was followed. It wasn't instinct, it was remembrance. Noah did not invent a new ritual. He revived a covenantal tradition that had been submerged under chaos. His offering wasn't a desperate plea, it was a structured, holy act. And it was in that exact moment, the scriptures say, that God re-established his covenant, not just with Noah, but with all living things. The rainbow would follow, the promises would be declared, but the altar came first. This tells us something profound. Ritual was not lost in the flood, it was only paused, and Noah was the one chosen to restart it, not as a creator of new ways, but as a faithful restorer of ancient ones. The same pattern that Abel had honored before the fall of civilization now re-emerged, reaffirmed by the only man righteous enough to carry it through judgment. In Noah, we see not just a survivor, but a keeper of rhythm. He understood that worship wasn't arbitrary, that timing mattered, that the offering required structure, that the sacred has an order. And through his obedience, he became the bridge between the world that was and the world that would be. The first act of post-flood humanity was not agriculture, architecture, or law, but sacrifice, aligned, precise, and holy. So the question is no longer whether worship existed before Moses. It's how deeply embedded it was in the lives of those who truly walked with God. Noah followed something older than Sinai, something whispered to Abel, something lived by Adam, something that would eventually become codified in Leviticus, but had already pulsed through generations of those who remembered. Noah didn't need a title to be a priest. He didn't need a scroll to know the pattern. He simply kept alive what the flood had tried to bury. And in doing so, he proved that the covenant could survive the end of the world, if only one man remembered the rhythm. When Abraham took his son Isaac up the mountain, most of us remember the story as one of faith, a man willing to surrender what he loved most in obedience to God. But the Book of Jubilees opens a deeper dimension to that moment, revealing that Abraham's act wasn't just faithful, it was precisely timed. According to Jubilees chapters 17 and 18, the event didn't happen on just any day. It happened on Mount Moriah during an appointed feast day, a sacred time already marked in heaven's calendar. This changes everything. Abraham didn't simply react to a voice. He aligned himself with a divine schedule. He cut wood, prepared the altar, placed his son on it, not in haste, but in reverence to timing. This was not just a test of the heart, it was a demonstration of covenantal rhythm. He wasn't making a statement, he was fulfilling a pattern. And that's the hidden truth. Abraham wasn't chosen merely because he believed. He was chosen because he remembered, he kept, he observed. He understood that the relationship between man and God was not only about trust, it was about timing, about obedience in both spirit and structure. He knew when to act, where to act, and how to act, not by human instinct, but by a knowledge passed down through generations, a knowledge that Cain ignored, that Abel honored, that Noah restored, and that Abraham now perfected in the most sacred place and at the most sacred time. It is easy to see Abraham as a hero of faith, but the Book of Jubilees pushes us further, to see him as a guardian of sacred practice, a man who kept the feasts, not yet written down, not yet institutionalized, but already known by the faithful. He followed a calendar not made by man, but embedded in creation, and by acting according to that calendar, he didn't just pass the test, he confirmed the covenant. What followed was not just a blessing, it was a sealing. Because when Abraham raised the knife, he was not only proving loyalty, he was showing that he understood the deeper structure of worship. Sacrifice offered on holy ground, at holy time, in holy manner. This is not mythology. It is a message that before the law was given at Sinai, before the priesthood was formed, before any scroll was written, there were men who kept God's time, men who walked in step with heaven, not abstractly, but tangibly, rhythmically, faithfully. Abraham was not the beginning of covenant. He was the continuation, the next voice in a song that started with Abel and survived the flood through Noah. He wasn't just the father of nations, he was a keeper of appointed times. And through his obedience, not just in belief, but in ritual, he anchored the covenant deeper into human history. This is not about tradition, it's about transmission. Abraham didn't create a system, he remembered one. And when the angel stopped his hand and provided the ram, it wasn't just mercy, it was confirmation. You remembered my rhythm. Now I will remember my promise. Moses was not the beginning of the covenant. He was its recorder, its legislator, its institutional voice. When he ascended Mount Sinai, he did not receive something entirely new. According to the Book of Jubilees, what he was given was a divine reminder, a restoration of feasts, appointed times, and sacred laws that had already been known, already been lived by those who came before him. Abel offered rightly. Noah restored the altar after the flood. Abraham kept the appointed day on Mount Moriah. Moses did not contradict them, he confirmed them. He gathered the scattered rhythm into written law. He codified a living memory into national covenant. The mountain wasn't the birthplace of sacred order. It was the place where heaven handed back a tradition humanity had begun to forget. So, if we long to return to the covenant, we must not only read what Moses wrote, we must remember what Abel lived. Because the story didn't begin at Sinai. It began with a lamb, with fire, with timing, and with a man who still heard the rhythm of Eden. When we think of priests, rituals, and sacred law, our minds often leap straight to the tribe of Levi, to the tabernacle, to the ordained system established under Moses. It's as if we instinctively believe that worship, real, legitimate worship, couldn't have existed before the Levites. That without titles, garments, and institutions, there could be no keepers of the law. But that assumption quietly erases a vast span of sacred history. Because Levi, the man, wasn't even born until thousands of years after Abel. So what happened between them? Was it a void, a spiritual vacuum, a gap in which no one held the rhythm, no one offered the right sacrifice, no one remembered the covenant? Or was there a hidden line, a quiet procession of unnamed stewards who kept the flame alive, not by position, but by faithfulness? The Book of Jubilees hints at something astonishing, that even without the priesthood, there were those who still knew when to offer, what to offer, and to whom. Shem, the son of Noah, emerges as one of these, not a priest by office, but a guardian of sacred timing. Abel, ancestor of Abraham, carried the knowledge through generations. Abraham himself, long before Levi was born, knew to build altars, to mark appointed days, to offer with precision. These men were not priests in title, but they were keepers of the covenant in action. They didn't wear robes, they didn't serve in temples. But they lived by a rhythm passed down, not through tablets of stone, but through memory, obedience, and reverence. They didn't need ceremony to hear heaven's timing. They listened, and they moved accordingly. So maybe the space between Abel and Levi isn't empty at all. Maybe it's filled with quiet faithfulness, men and women whose names are barely mentioned, but whose actions ensured that the sacred calendar was never lost. Perhaps the law was never dependent on a title, but always dependent on a heart willing to remember, to move in rhythm, to offer not just what is good, but what is right. And if that's true, then we must ask ourselves, have we missed something essential? Have we assumed that only official roles can carry the sacred, while overlooking those who, in silence, have always kept it alive? They didn't write scrolls. They didn't deliver grand sermons. Their names rarely appear in the center of sacred narratives. But without them, the covenant would have vanished. The rhythm would have stopped. The law would have faded into myth. These silent stewards, men like Shem and Abel, never stood on mountaintops, yet they carried a fire that never went out. According to the Book of Jubilees, after the flood, it was Shem who preserved the sacred calendar. In a world rebuilding itself from chaos, he kept the rhythm alive, not through power or prestige, but through quiet obedience. He knew when the seasons turned. He remembered which days were holy. He honored the unseen structure of time, and through that memory, the covenant endured. Abel, the great-grandfather of Abraham, passed that rhythm forward. He didn't deliver commandments, but he delivered something deeper, the sense of timing, of place, of pattern. Because of him, Abraham knew not only what to sacrifice, but when and where. That's not instinct, that's inheritance, a hidden lineage, not of blood, but of rhythm, of memory, of faithfulness. These men were not priests, but they were practitioners of order. Their role wasn't to change the world, but to preserve what heaven had already given. They were the hinges upon which history quietly turned. The law did not begin with Moses. It was safeguarded by generations of faithful ones whose lives kept the chain from breaking. So when Moses received the commandments at Sinai, he was not receiving a brand new revelation. He was retrieving what had been carefully guarded all along. A system remembered, a pattern preserved, a pulse still beating beneath the surface of history. And here is the question that remains. If there is no temple today, no Levitical priesthood, no altar standing in Jerusalem, does that mean the rhythm has died? Or could it be that the call has shifted to those willing to keep time in the quiet, to those who, like Shem and Abel, don't need recognition to be faithful? Maybe the next link in the chain is not someone famous, not someone ordained. Maybe it's someone like you, someone who remembers, who watches the seasons, who sets apart a day, who honors a pattern the world has forgotten. Maybe what they preserved is waiting to be continued by hands just as quiet and hearts just as faithful. For generations, we've been taught that the law began at Mount Sinai, that it was handed to Moses in a moment of thunder and fire, new, divine, unprecedented. But what if that's not the full story? What if Sinai wasn't the beginning, but a reminder, a restoration of something ancient, something nearly forgotten? The Book of Jubilees quietly but powerfully reframes this assumption. It tells us that long before Moses climbed the mountain, the law had already been revealed, not as written code, but as living rhythm. Abel offered the right sacrifice with the right portions at the right time. Noah emerged from the flood and built an altar, not from instinct, but with knowledge of clean animals and sacred timing. Abraham offered Isaac on Mount Moriah, not spontaneously, but on the exact day of an appointed feast according to an inherited calendar. These weren't emotional gestures. They were acts of remembrance. Each patriarch lived not by invention, but by a pattern, passed down, preserved, and practiced. Moses did not originate the law. He documented it. He received in tablets and instructions what others had lived without paper or title. He was not the first to keep the sacred rhythm. He was the one called to institutionalize it, because the world had begun to forget. This means the law is not rooted in a moment of dramatic revelation, but in a long, slow pulse, one that beat through the heart of Abel, through the footsteps of Noah, through the obedience of Abraham. The law was already present, in timing, in sacrifice, in sacred memory, woven into the very life of those who walked closely with God. And that should shake us, because it tells us that obedience didn't begin with rules, it began with rhythm. That Jau-uk, the covenant, was never about paperwork, but about people who still heard the sacred drumbeat of heaven even when no one else did. If we believe the law started at Sinai, we treat it like a contract. But if we realize it started in Eden, in the offerings of Abel, in the altar of Noah, in the journey of Abraham, then we begin to see it as a calling, a way of life, a memory passed from soul to soul, waiting to be remembered again. Not a new law, a forgotten one, and maybe it's time to remember. Moses is often seen as the lawgiver, the one who brought order to a chaotic people, the founder of Israel's religious structure. But the Book of Jubilees gives us a different image, one both humbling and profound. According to Jubilees chapters 1 and 2, when Moses ascended Mount Sinai, he didn't receive a brand new system. He was handed a recorded memory, a calendar, a sacred rhythm that had existed long before the tablets were etched with fire. It wasn't just commandments he received, it was a timeline, a complete restoration of sacred days, appointed feasts, Sabbaths, offerings, and holy patterns that had been kept since the beginning. Abel had known them, Noah had followed them, Abraham had walked in them. Moses, chosen not to create, but to remember. The angel didn't say, "Here is something new." He said, "Here is what your forefathers kept." The festivals weren't innovations, they were recoveries. The Sabbath wasn't a first-time decree, it was a return to the rhythm embedded in creation itself. Moses was not a founder, he was a scribe of forgotten time. Imagine someone uncovering the fragments of a lost symphony, notes scattered, melodies half-remembered, and painstakingly writing it down so that others could hear it again. That was Moses. Each feast he recorded, each law he copied, each measurement he transcribed, was not his invention. It was his act of preservation. That's why the covenant at Sinai feels both new and ancient, because it was not a revolution, it was a reawakening. The law did not start there, it was reaffirmed. And Moses, far from being a lone visionary, was a vessel of memory, carrying what had been lived but not yet written. His greatness lies not in originality, but in faithfulness to what heaven had already spoken. This reframes our view of the law, not as a system imposed on Israel, but as a legacy remembered, a rhythm restored, a divine inheritance copied into scrolls so it could be passed on without distortion. So when we think of Moses, let us not see a solitary man inventing religion on a mountaintop. Let us see a prophet reaching backward into the days of Abel, of Noah, of Abraham, and bringing forward a sacred calendar that had always been ticking beneath the surface of time. His role wasn't to start something, it was to write it down before we forgot. We often think of the covenant as a contract, a list of terms, obligations, do's and don'ts sealed in sacred ink. But what if we've misunderstood its essence? What if the covenant isn't merely a set of laws, but a living rhythm, a divine cadence that moves through time, through people, through sacred moments? According to the Book of Jubilees and the testimonies of Scripture, the covenant was never just legal, it was musical, a pattern, a pulse. Abel stepped into it, not with words, but with an offering, the firstborn of his flock, the fat portions, given not randomly, but in the right form at the right time. Noah followed, emerging from the flood, not to claim land or build monuments, but to rebuild the altar. He offered clean animals in the proper manner, and it was then that God renewed the covenant. Abraham climbed Mount Moriah, not out of ritual obligation, but in step with an appointed feast day. He built the altar. He placed the wood. He prepared the sacrifice, his son, at the exact time prescribed in the heavenly calendar. And that moment, heavy with sorrow and obedience, became the turning point of the promise. Moses didn't originate this rhythm. He recorded it. He wrote down the feast days, the sacred times, the weekly Sabbath, not to invent religion, but to remind the people how to move again in harmony with heaven. And then came Jesus. The Lamb of God did not die at a random hour. He offered himself on the very day of Passover, at the very hour when the lambs were being slaughtered in the temple. He bled in the rhythm. His sacrifice was not a break from the old. It was the crescendo. The covenant was not discarded. It was fulfilled in its exact timing, by the exact form, in the exact rhythm first kept by Abel. So no, the covenant didn't end. It continues in those who still walk to its beat. It lives not in theory, but in those who pause when they should pause, offer when they should offer, rest when they should rest. It's not about checking religious boxes. It's about living a sacred tempo. And now the question turns to you, not what you believe, but how you live. Are you walking in sync with the divine rhythm, or have you forgotten the beat? Because the covenant is not a book on a shelf. It's a life lived in time with heaven, and it still moves, waiting for hearts willing to move with it. Abel had no title. He wore no priestly robes. He stood in no temple, followed no established religion, and bore no tribal identity like the Levites who would come generations later. And yet, God looked upon his offering with favor. Why? Because Abel did something sacred. He offered the right thing, in the right way, at the right time. He didn't invent worship. He stepped into a divine order already whispered through creation. He knew to offer the firstborn of his flock. He knew to bring the fat portions, something later codified in the law of Moses, but present in Abel long before Sinai. He knew the rhythm, not by law, but by alignment. Not because he held office, but because he held reverence. And that's the startling truth. He didn't need a title to be heard by heaven. Abel's story reveals something deeply liberating, something that should awaken every soul that's ever felt too small, too unqualified, or too far removed from religious systems. God's gaze does not rest on titles. It rests on obedience, on timing, on alignment with the sacred rhythm. This means that you don't need to be a priest to enter the covenant. You don't need ordination or a pulpit or even a building. You need only to know what is clean, to know what is sacred, and to live accordingly. To offer what is right, not just what is available. To pause when heaven calls pause. To act when heaven says act. Abel didn't change history with words. He changed it with a sacrifice, with a single, silent act that echoed through the generations. And because of that, he became the first recorded human to truly walk in step with heaven's design. So maybe, just maybe, that same invitation extends to you. Not to become something grand, but to become something faithful, to live in a rhythm that predates religion, to step into the covenant, not by title, but by truth. Abel didn't need a temple. He became one, and if he could, so can you. When Moses stood on the mountain, chisel in hand and cloud beneath his feet, He was not inventing a new religion. He was listening, carefully, reverently, to a voice that had been echoing since the beginning. What he wrote on the tablets was not a breakthrough. It was a recollection, a memory chiseled into time. He didn't conjure a covenant out of divine inspiration. He traced it. He gathered the fragments: Abel's offering, Noah's altar, Abraham's obedience, and wove them back into harmony. He was not a creator. He was a restorer of rhythm. The Book of Jubilees reveals that the instructions Moses received weren't new at all. They were the very same sacred patterns once kept by the patriarchs: feasts, Sabbaths, offerings, holy days. Moses simply gave them form, ink, stone, structure, so a forgetful people could remember, so a scattered rhythm could pulse again. Moses didn't call the people to something revolutionary. He called them back to something ancient, something quiet, something sacred that had been buried beneath generations of noise. He was a man sent not to innovate, but to recover. And perhaps that's where you come in, because every generation forgets. Every age replaces the rhythm with noise, the offering with convenience, the holy with the habitual. And every now and then, the world needs someone, not necessarily a prophet, not a scholar, not a priest, but someone who hears the faint echo of Eden, someone who senses a pattern worth restoring. You don't need a mountaintop to do that. You don't need stone tablets. You just need a heart willing to pause and listen. Maybe that's what you're feeling now, a quiet urge to return to something older than doctrine, deeper than ritual, a covenant not made by ink, but by timing, by obedience, by fire. Moses didn't invent the sacred order. He reminded us it existed. And maybe in your own time, in your own way, you're being asked to do the same. Not to shout, not to rewrite, just to remember and live accordingly. Because sometimes the holiest thing you can do is to walk in step with a song you didn't write, but were always meant to carry. Jesus did not die on just any day. He died on Passover, not by accident, not as a coincidence, but with divine precision. At the very hour the lambs were being slaughtered in the temple, the Lamb of God was lifted up on a Roman cross. As the priests in Jerusalem prepared their sacrifices, Jesus offered his own body, not merely as a symbol, but as the fulfillment of a sacred sequence that had begun long before Sinai, long before Egypt, long before the law was even written. This was not improvisation. It was orchestration. From the beginning, the covenant was a rhythm, a sacred timing passed through generations. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock. Noah selected the clean animals, offering them in the correct order. Abraham ascended Mount Moriah on the exact day marked in the divine calendar. None of them acted on impulse. They acted in time. And Jesus, he stepped into that same rhythm, not to disrupt it, but to complete it. He was the Passover lamb, not figuratively, not poetically, but literally, in time, in form, in fulfillment. His blood didn't merely echo the blood on the doorposts of Israel in Egypt. It continued that covenantal act, sealing it with a final and perfect offering. And it had to happen then, not a day earlier, not an hour later. Because the redemption of the world was not just about the act, It was about the timing. Jesus wasn't crucified because events spiraled out of control. He laid down his life at the precise moment appointed from before the foundation of the world. He knew the day, he knew the hour, and he chose it. This is how heaven works. Not randomly, not chaotically, but in sacred alignment. To say that Jesus died on Passover is not just to note a historical fact. It's to recognize a pattern that reaches back to Eden. A pulse that ran through Abel's altar, Noah's fire, Abraham's ascent, Moses' stone tablets, and culminated in a cross. So when Jesus said, "It is finished," it was not just the end of suffering, it was the completion of timing. He didn't break the cycle, he fulfilled it. He didn't override the law, he embodied it. He didn't rise above the calendar, he walked in it perfectly. And through that perfect offering, made in the perfect moment, he opened a way, not just for salvation, but for us to step back into the rhythm we were always meant to live by. This wasn't symbolism, it was fulfillment. This wasn't mythology, it was history on schedule, sacred, deliberate, and eternal. The cross did not cancel the feast, it completed it. For centuries, we've heard the message that the Old Covenant was abolished, that the New Testament wiped clean what came before. But what if that's not what happened at all? What if the cross wasn't a rupture in sacred history, but its culmination? Think of the blood on the doorposts in Egypt during that first Passover night. It was not just a ritual, it was the shield that marked those who belonged to the covenant. That blood saved households from the angel of death. But only because it was the right blood, applied at the right time, in the way heaven had ordained. Now, fast forward. Jesus is crucified. His blood flows, not on a random day, not as a tragic accident, but on the very same day the lambs are being slaughtered once again for the feast of Passover. It's not symbolic, it's synchronized. If Jesus had died on another day, in another way, it wouldn't have connected, it wouldn't have fulfilled. The rhythm would have been broken, the covenant would have remained incomplete. But he didn't miss a beat. Every act he performed, riding into Jerusalem, overturning the tables, sharing the bread and wine, walking to Golgotha, was timed not by human schedule, but by divine rhythm. He wasn't abolishing the feast, he was becoming it. He wasn't ending the covenant, he was sealing it. The Old Testament patterns didn't vanish at the cross. They were finally understood. The sacrifices, the sacred times, the appointed feasts, they all pointed to a deeper fulfillment. And that fulfillment arrived not in contradiction, but in continuity. Jesus did not erase the law. He embodied its spirit, walked its calendar, and fulfilled its prophetic structure. He did not replace the sacred cycle. He brought it to its full meaning, because the true power of the covenant lies not in performing rituals without understanding, but in walking with God through time, in step with his appointed rhythm. That rhythm did not stop at Sinai. It did not end at the temple, and it did not dissolve at the cross. It climaxed there. The blood on wood saved Israel for a night. The blood on the cross saves the world for eternity. But both happened in the same rhythm, the same pulse, the same calendar of heaven. And so, no, the new did not cancel the old. It fulfilled the pattern, it honored the rhythm, and it restored the covenant to its true center. Not by abolishing it, but by living it to its very last breath. If the covenant is not merely a belief but a sacred rhythm, then the question is not just what you believe, but when and how you live it. We often think that sincerity is enough, that if we offer God what we feel is good, our time, our prayers, our efforts, then that is sufficient. But Scripture doesn't merely honor sincerity, it honors alignment. From Abel to Noah, from Abraham to Jesus, every true act of devotion happened in rhythm, not randomly, but in step with the divine calendar. Abel didn't just offer any lamb, he offered the firstborn at the appointed time. Noah didn't sacrifice after the flood simply because he was grateful. He waited, selected the clean animals, and offered them in order. Abraham didn't ascend Mount Moriah on a whim. He went when he was called, on the very day marked in heaven's timepiece. And Jesus, he didn't go to the cross whenever the political climate allowed. He waited until Passover, until the exact hour the lambs were slain, until the rhythm that began in Eden had come full circle. They all lived by the sacred schedule. And now we must ask ourselves, are we? Do we rest when it's convenient, or do we honor the Sabbath as it was appointed? Do we feast when the world feasts, or when the heavens open a window? Do we give what we think God wants, or what He has already asked for? Because if the covenant is a living pulse, then walking with God means walking in time with Him, not just believing the right doctrines, not just reading the right scriptures, but living the right rhythm. The modern world runs on a calendar built for commerce, convenience, and control. But the calendar of heaven was never meant to be efficient. It was meant to be holy. It was designed to shape your week, your year, your heart. And here's the truth that changes everything. Jesus Himself did not step outside of it. He didn't bypass the rhythm. He fulfilled it, not just with His words, but with His steps, His seasons, His surrender. So why should we think we can live outside of it and still expect to be in sync with the covenant? If the Son of God submitted to the divine rhythm, then following Him means doing likewise. It means pausing when the world rushes. It means remembering when others forget. It means offering, not what we choose, but what heaven has ordained. So I ask you now, not in judgment, but in invitation, whose calendar are you living by? The one handed to you by culture and convenience, or the one whispered by eternity, kept by Abel, restored by Noah, lived by Abraham, recorded by Moses, and fulfilled by Christ? The covenant is not a theory, it is a rhythm, and if you want to step into it, you must learn to walk in time. Not everyone is called a priest. Not everyone is given a title, a pulpit, or a scroll. But everyone can hold a rhythm. The sacred rhythm of the covenant was never reserved for the elite or the ordained. It was never dependent on robes, rituals, or recognition. It began with someone like Abel. No title, no tribe, no tabernacle, just a man who gave the right offering at the right time, in the right way. And because of that, heaven looked upon him with favor. You don't need a platform to honor the rhythm. You need awareness. You need intention. Maybe you're not standing before multitudes. Maybe your hands don't touch sacred instruments, but you can pause and pray at the right hour. You can forgive someone before the sun sets. You can fast, not for display, but because the Spirit stirred you on the exact day heaven was whispering now. You don't need recognition to make the covenant real. You need alignment. This is what makes the covenant so breathtakingly accessible. It doesn't ask for power, it asks for obedience. It doesn't seek performance, it invites participation. Abel did not write scrolls, he kept no temple, but he stepped into the rhythm, and that made him a keeper of the covenant. So can you. You can be the one who watches the sky, who senses the time, who knows in your spirit, this is the moment to act. Maybe no one else will see, maybe no one will applaud, but heaven will notice, because every sacred rhythm needs someone willing to guard it, carry it, live it. The covenant doesn't require position, it only asks, will you keep the time? And if your heart says yes, then you are already part of something eternal. You are a keeper, not of doctrines, but of rhythm. You are not forgotten, you are chosen, in the quiet, in the hidden, in the faithful ticking of God's calendar. And that is more than enough. When just one person honors the time, honors the day, honors the word, the covenant does not die. It comes alive again. It doesn't take a temple to revive it. It doesn't need a system of priests or a nation gathered at a mountain. It needs one person who remembers, one person who still listens for the sacred rhythm and answers it with action. That's how it has always worked. Abel didn't wait for someone to appoint him. He offered what was right when it was right, and the covenant breathed. Noah stood on a cleansed earth, surrounded by silence, and laid down offerings according to the appointed day, and the covenant rose again. Abraham took his son up the mountain at the time heaven had marked, and the covenant echoed across generations. Moses did not invent the pattern, he simply recorded what had always been, and because he wrote it down, we remember. The thread never snapped. It passed from hand to hand, quietly, faithfully, and now it reaches yours. If you keep the rhythm, the calendar does not die. If you live the day as holy, the covenant does not fade. If you guard the appointed times, even when no one else sees or understands, then you become part of a living chain. The covenant is not dependent on visibility. It is sustained by continuity. And continuity begins with one choice, yours. You don't have to carry it all. You don't have to be perfect. But if you keep even one piece of the rhythm alive, a prayer on the right day, a rest on the appointed Sabbath, an act of mercy in its season, then the covenant rises again in this world. It pulses again in your life. It speaks again through your faithfulness. And if you keep it, the next generation will have something to inherit, not just teachings, but time, not just belief, but breath. You don't have to fix the whole world, just keep the rhythm, and the covenant will live again, starting with you. This video may have been long, but if just one thing made you pause, hold on to it. Maybe it was a sentence that stirred something in you. Maybe it was a single image or an unfamiliar thought that settled deep into your spirit like a quiet whisper. Maybe it wasn't even something you can explain, but it moved you. That is the rhythm calling. Don't let it fade. Choose one thing today to carry forward. One thing to keep, not just in memory, but in motion. A sacred act, a sacred time, a sacred promise. Maybe it's committing to honor one feast this year, not out of tradition, but out of alignment. Maybe it's setting aside a Sabbath, not the one on your calendar, but the one heaven appointed. Maybe it's a promise to forgive, to fast, to pray, or to remember on the right day in the right way. It doesn't have to be everything. It just has to be real. Drop it in the comments. What will you keep? Will you guard a festival, observe a rest, speak a vow to God and mean it? Not someday, but now. Your comment won't just be a line of text. It will be a witness, a testimony, a thread in the tapestry of covenant that stretches from Eden to today. You don't need to be a scholar. You don't need a platform. You just need to respond, to say, "This is what I will keep." That's how it begins. That's how it continues. Because every generation needs someone to hold the rhythm. And maybe this moment, right here, is the start of yours. So choose. Keep one thing, just one. Let it mark you, let it move you, and let it echo into the generations yet to come. Abel's story is short, barely a few lines, no long speeches, no miracles, no legacy written in stone. And yet God looked upon him and received his offering. Why? Because Abel lived his part. He didn't write laws. He didn't lead a people. He didn't build an altar for the world to see, but he kept the rhythm, quietly, faithfully, and heaven took notice. Now pause. In this age of noise and screens and endless voices telling you what to believe, what to do, what to chase, can you still hear it? That quiet pulse, somewhere deeper than opinion, deeper than culture. The sacred rhythm that hasn't faded, but waits to be remembered. If you hear it, even faintly, then you have been chosen, not to preach, but to preserve, not to perform, but to keep. You don't have to be a priest. You don't need a title. Abel didn't have one. What he had was alignment. His life moved in time with a pattern older than words. That was enough, and it still is. Because when even one person lives in rhythm with the sacred, the covenant breathes again, not from a pulpit, not in a ceremony, but in you. So here is the truth no one tells you. This story was never meant to stay on a page. It was never meant to be locked in parchment and forgotten in doctrine. It was always meant to live in each person who dares to carry it forward, not just by remembering it, but by becoming it. The story isn't over. It didn't end with Abel, or Noah, or Abraham, or Moses. It didn't end with the cross. It didn't end with the early church. It hasn't ended with the silence of forgotten traditions. Because if you are still listening, then you are the next chapter. Not to explain the covenant, but to walk in it. Not to rewrite it, but to revive it. The story lives in the one who keeps time with heaven. And today, that could be you. There are 7 days in a week. The moon marks its cycles. The seasons rise and fall in quiet rhythm. But among them, one day, one sacred time, was not placed there by man. It was set by heaven. What if all you had to do was keep one of those days? Not the holidays of the world, not the schedule printed on your wall, but a day set apart in the ancient rhythm, the rhythm that Abel honored, that Noah remembered after the flood, that Abraham followed up the mountain, that Moses recorded on the stone, and that Jesus fulfilled down to the hour. You don't have to start with a system. You don't need a temple. You don't need to understand the whole calendar. Just begin with one day, a Sabbath, a feast, a fast, a pause, a return. Choose one day, not because it's convenient, but because it's true. Set it apart, not for ritual, but for relationship, not for duty, but for devotion. A day to remember the covenant. A day to breathe the rhythm again. Maybe it's a day to rest, not when the world tells you to, but when the heavens once did. Maybe it's a day to thank, to surrender, to remain silent, to honor something beyond yourself. Whatever it is, let it be intentional. Let it be in time. That one act might feel small, but it is not. Because one thread held tightly in your hands becomes the beginning of a larger weave. It links you to Abel, to Noah, to Abraham. It draws a quiet line through time and ties your heart to the heart of God, not with words, but with rhythm. And if enough of us keep that rhythm, the ancient calendar will awaken. The covenant will no longer be a doctrine buried in pages. It will be a living pattern again. So pick one day, guard it, live it, and know this: when you keep that day, you're not just keeping time, you're keeping the covenant alive.